Hello and welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Haas, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thank you so much for listening. If you listened to the last episode, you got to know Nick Dugmore a little bit. After talking with Nick, he surprised me by letting me know he wanted to sponsor an episode of the podcast. I gave him an idea of the episodes I had coming up, and he chose this one because it features the first winery in the world to get Regenerative Organic Certification. I asked Nick for some ad copy that I could use to let people know about his sponsorship, and I was again surprised by what he sent. Rather than talking about himself and his winery and what kinds of wines he makes or where you can buy them, he said this: "We at The Stoke wanted to sponsor the Beyond Organic Wine podcast because of the importance of the message that so many of these conversations bring. Our future generations depend on us, and education is the key to a change in our concepts of how we could and should be farming and treating our soils. It doesn't matter your level of education with these topics, as long as you are willing to learn and your heart is in the right place, you will make a difference. And it doesn't matter the size, as it all adds up. Keep pushing and please keep chatting. Let's do this." Yeah, I'll just add that you can find out more about Nick's winery and where you can get his wines by going to stokewines.au. And I hope you're as impressed by Nick's ad as I am, and that you feel as strongly as I do that this is the kind of sponsor who deserves our support and patronage. If you haven't listened to Nick's story, please check out his episode from last week. The question that I'm thinking about this week is, do we really need to dumb wine down, or do we need to raise the level of our expectations at a cultural level? The truth about being financially successful in the drinks business is that it has nothing to do with the growth of the fruit or the production of the beverage. It has to do with the marketing. The most financially successful businesses sell a lifestyle brand, not a beverage. They market their beverages by associating it with sexy, cool, chic, fun, glamorous imagery, people, locations, and moments. And this works because our psychology is motivated most powerfully at an emotional level. If you put what we feel up against what we think, what we feel wins out almost every time. So there you go. That's the secret formula to a financially successful wine business. My financial failure as a wine business personally, and the cause of our financial failures as a wine industry, is that we are asking people to think when we should be asking them to feel. In other words, we've been talking about terroir and organic farming when we should be showing hot, smiling, young, stylish people sharing a steamy sunset hot tub with a bottle of our wine on the ledge. As true as this may be, I'm not sure it has to be the only truth. Notice I've carefully described this as the way to achieve financial success. What other kinds of success might we consider achieving through our businesses? I'm going to make a big assumption here. If you're listening to this, my guess is you actually care about the substance of what goes into a wine. It's important to you to know how wine is grown. You might even care to look beyond a label like organic, to want to know if a wine comes from a system that considers more than just what kind of sprays it uses to grow the grapes. We could have both. We could have amazing, beyond organically farmed wine that we market with hot tubs. The problem with the sexy, cool lifestyle marketing approach, whether it embraces a hot tub or some version of chic nightlife, is that any kind of beverage can use it. It encourages us not to care about what's behind our beverage choice. It begs us to be thoughtless. Of course, thoughtlessness is so much easier, more convenient, and quicker than being thoughtful. And I do honestly have a lot of sympathy for all of us who have so little time. I wonder who benefits from us being so busy that we want and even need to cut corners in our thinking. After multiple despairing bouts of if you can't beat 'em, join 'em, when I consider embracing lifestyle marketing, I begin to ask myself, what kind of culture do I want to strive for? Can I promote my deepest values by simply increasing sales of my regeneratively farmed wine through lifestyle marketing? Do I want to continue to accommodate the lowest common denominator of our primal urges? Or do I want to normalize thoughtful consumption? Is dollars spent by consumers the only measure of success for regenerative agriculture? What about measuring the degree to which we move our culture toward more regenerative thinking? My guest for this episode is Jason Haas. Jason is the partner and general manager of Tablas Creek Winery in Paso Robles, California. I hope that you've heard of Tablas Creek. But if not, let me give you a short list of their environmental leadership in the wine industry. Tablas Creek was the first Regenerative Organic Certified winery in the world. They've been farming organically since their start in 1989, certified organic since 2005, and certified biodynamic since 2015. They employ a full-time shepherd to manage a year-round flock of over 250 sheep that rotationally graze their 270 acres of vineyards, as well as the woodlands around them. Their winery is 100% solar powered, and they use their wastewater to feed a native species wetland. They are leaders in reducing glass bottle weights and bringing awareness to the many downsides of heavy glass bottles. And they are pioneering alternative packaging for ultra premium wine. And this is just a short list. We talk about all of this as well as get into the technicalities of no-till and low-till considerations in regenerative viticulture. We talk about how Tablas Creek has brought every grape variety from Chateauneuf du Pape to the U.S. through the rigorous quarantining process that can take over a decade. And it's likely that if you've drunk a wine from the U.S. made with a Rhone variety of grape, you can thank Tablas Creek for that. Behind all of this, I hope you get a sense of the timeline of the vision for this winery. It extends beyond Jason's or any single person's lifetime. It's a vision of continual incremental improvement, of regeneration over centuries. It's a vision that I hope inspires the way we think about wine. Enjoy. Jason, welcome. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Adam.
I told you that, I feel remiss for not having you on sooner because of the specialness that is Tablas Creek, who you represent. But I think my fear is that once I crack that seal, I'm going to have you on once a month because of all the incredible stuff that you guys are doing. There's just, you guys are, I'll just put it out there that I think what you guys are leaders in the world globally in the kind of farming and winemaking that you guys are doing. Wine growing that you're doing, the kind of business operations that you're doing. And in terms of just earth first, earth forward, amazing stuff. And I wonder if you could just, I'm happy to list some of the things that I know, but maybe it's easier for you to just list some of the amazing things that you guys have been up to in the past 20 plus years.
Oh, just that? Well, yeesh, that's kind of a lot of pressure. But I should say, first of all, that it's, even though I haven't been on the podcast, it's not like you haven't had Tablas Creek represented. You did a great episode with our shepherd, Nathan Stewart, a couple of years ago, which I just re-listened to, and it was terrific. So thank you for that.
If anybody hasn't listened to that, please do. It's that was part of the other reason I probably didn't reach out. I just didn't want to overexpose to make it sound like it was the Tablas Creek podcast. But that is honestly, that was a really game-changing conversation that I had with Nathan. He introduced me to Alan Savory. It was the first time I'd heard about Alan Savory, and started researching rotational grazing. And there were a whole number of podcasts that spilled out after that. Nathan put me in touch with Kelly Mulville and just incredible folks up and down the West Coast, and now around the world that I've found. And so it was, anybody should go back to that one and listen to it if they haven't.
Yeah, it's he's great. Nathan's awesome. But it's to go back to the question that you originally asked. I don't know that I can rattle off a list, but I could maybe talk about sort of our journey from where we started thinking that really organic farming was a means to an end of showing off terroir, to kind of where we are now, where we're so much more conscious of not just all of the implications of the choices that we're making, but of the urgency of continuing to make more choices. Maybe that's a good way to start into this.
Yeah. Well, I do love that it sort of started as this is just the best way to reflect terroir if you're trying to make wines of place. But you are in what I would say is, a climate that is experiencing as much as any are, but some of the extremes of what's happening with our climate more than others to a certain extent. Is that fair to say?
Yes and no. It's
Okay, all right.
interesting that, I mean, obviously, I think some of the things that we're seeing more frequent droughts. We're seeing, um, obviously, some record heat waves and high temperatures, though this year has been cool. And then last winter, we also had record breaking rainfall. And not this past May, but the May before, we had our latest ever frost. So, whatever the kind of climate chaos idea is, I think we've certainly seen pieces of that. But
Right.
um, it's been interesting for me to talk with our French partners, the Parents, and realize the extent to which they're seeing things that we aren't. I mean, and I should start probably with a little bit of history, because for people who don't know, Tablas Creek is co-founded and still co-owned and co-run by two families. One of them is my family. My dad was Robert Haas. He founded an importing company called Vineyard Brands, introduced a whole bunch of great wines, mostly from France, but not exclusively, into the U.S. market. And one of the families whose wines he introduced was the Parent family from Chateauneuf du Pape. And the Parents are who we decided to launch a kind of a riff on Chateauneuf du Pape in California with. And that was what would become Tablas Creek eventually when we bought this property in 1989. But listening to them talk about the things that they're dealing with over there made me go in and do a little bit of digging into what some of the more advanced climate models are suggesting about where the impacts of climate change are likely to be the greatest. And one of the things that was, I mean, it makes sense if you think about it, but was a little surprising to me, is that the Mediterranean coast of Europe is one of the areas which looks like it's going to accumulate heat at roughly double the rate globally. So if the temperature goes up 1 degree globally, you can expect the Mediterranean coast of France and Spain and Italy to go up 2 degrees.
Right.
And I think that's largely because the Mediterranean is a relatively shallow sea, and Europe is warmed by the Gulf Stream, which
Mm.
is supercharged as the climate gets warmer. So you end up just with more heat accumulating in that particular part of the world, and they're dealing with things that we're not. Like, how do you harvest Grenache at a potential alcohol of less than 16%? Like, we don't really have to worry about that. I mean, we're seeing roughly, similar sugar levels to where we've always seen. We're just seeing the arrival and the patterns and the long-term trends of things like rainfall and storms shifting in ways that give us some reason to doubt that a lot of our historical data is really all that predictive of what we'll see in the future.
Yeah. Well, you might be experiencing a little bit of how to deal with things that are late ripening this year, at least, right? I saw some creative use of straw mats and roussan.
Yeah, I mean, Roussan's always a struggle at the end of harvest, and this year, with it already being November and the Roussan still not being ripe, and our days already getting short, and we've had 3 frosts here already. We're trying to come up with like, what can we do to get this Roussan just over the hump and ready to start fermenting. So yeah, laying them out on straw, as we would if we were making dessert wines in the Vin de Paille style, is one of the relatively limited number of tools we have in our toolkit. So yeah, that's what we've been doing. We've got one batch of Roussan coming off the straw today, and another one going on there.
Nice. Yeah,
We're hoping it gives us just that little bit of extra concentration and ripeness.
well, that's great. Yeah, I mean, you guys have been certified organic since you started in the 90s, right?
We've been farming organically since we started in 1989, but we didn't get certified until the National Organic Program standards came into place. So we didn't bother with certification until 2003.
Okay.
But this all comes out of our connection with what the Parents do at Beaucastel. They've been fully organic since the 1950s. And they only used chemicals for like a decade after World War II, when like every government agency and every viticultural association was basically saying, like, this is how you become a modern farmer.
Right.
This is how you are going to produce at better yields with less disease pressure and be more responsible to your neighbors. And I mean, there was such a push towards this kind of modern chemical input sort of farming.
Right.
And in the mid 50s, Jacques Perrin just decided that this didn't feel right. He felt like this wasn't the way that he'd learned to farm from his father, and decided that he would go a year without using any of the chemicals at Beaucastel, and was blown away with how much more the wines that he made that year tasted to him like Beaucastel, like that place, than what he'd been doing for the previous decade. And for them, it was like that was it. That was the moment, and they haven't used chemicals ever since. And so when we started, it was really that kind of lens that we were thinking about our farming, and that this was the right way to give us the best possible chance to show off our terroir. Well, all of the other stuff was considered great that we're not putting chemicals out there that we would worry about, or that we would want to worry about exposing our team or our neighborhood to. But that was definitely secondary to the idea of farming organically as a way of amplifying terroir.
Yeah, that's great. And then you started biodynamic farming as well.
Yeah, and that was pretty directly out of trying to figure out, really, if we're trying to amplify terroir, what's the best way to do it. And in practical terms, the way that a lot of organic farming is executed in wine and outside is that it's concerned with the replacement of chemical inputs with non-chemical alternatives. Right. So you're still putting on inputs. You're still bringing in organic fertilizer. You're still spraying, but you're spraying with like soaps or oils or something which is less systemic than a chemical spray would be. Right. And so we were trying to identify which of those inputs we could eliminate and instead create an alternative that would come from this property. So instead of organic fertilizer, like, could we create our own fertility from our own cover crops? And we felt like we could get part of the way there, but not all the way there. Like, well, what if we integrated some sheep? And we had our first dozen sheep in 2012. And we're super impressed with what that did to the health of the cover crops after the sheep had been grazing there, and what happened to the sections of the vineyard that we were able to graze. So that became a whole thing of its own. And we built up that flock from a dozen sheep in that first year to 250 sheep last year, and had to hire a shepherd and get all into this rotational grazing and mob grazing. And all of that then led us to, well, how do we foster other sorts of biodiversity in the property? So if we don't want to have to release beneficial insects or spray with the soaps and the oils, how do we create habitat that will naturally attract those beneficial insects? How do we create an environment where they can winter over and I think even more importantly, summer over in this dry climate? So we started leaving sections with native vegetation and then planting other sections that we knew with plants that we knew would attract the things that we wanted, and then irrigating that even as we moved away from irrigating the rest of the vineyard, so that we could keep things blooming year round and create habitat for the bugs that we wanted. And so it was sort of this idea of trying to create this closed system, trying to eliminate all of the outside inputs that we could, that led us to biodynamics. And I think that's sort of, it may be a different way than a lot of people think of what biodynamics is all about, because biodynamics has this reputation. I mean, the stuff that people know about it tends to be the more mystical stuff, the
cow horns and lunar calendars.
Yeah, cow horns, lunar calendars, cycles of the moon, whatever, all of that stuff. And I remember hearing a talk from John Williams of Frog's Leap, where he basically dismissed all of that in two sentences and said all of that was a distraction from what really mattered about biodynamics, which was creating this biodiverse ecosystem that reestablished a plant's ability to make sense of its environment. Mm-hmm. I mean, that really resonated with me. And we actually were doing all of this ecological stuff without thinking that it would lead to biodynamic certification. And we ended up inviting down the guy who oversaw certification for the West Coast for Demeter in 2015, I think, 2015 or 2016. And and basically laid out to him, like, here's all the stuff that we're doing with the biodiversity and soil health, integrated grazing, all of that. Like, we're happy to do the preps, but we're not sure the extent to which those really matter. And there's some pieces like the biodynamic calendar where you're supposed to pick on certain days and prune on certain days and all of that we really don't like. We think it can be actively counterproductive. And just tell us if we have to do all of that to get certified, then we won't bother. But we just want to get an assessment of where we are. And the guy said, like, honestly, if you want to ignore all of the calendar stuff, go for it. We don't care. We do need you to be a little more systematic in the way that you apply the preps. We feel like that's an important piece. But ultimately, we want you inside the biodynamic program because we think that the things that you're doing with soil health, biodiversity, and integrated livestock grazing, like, this is so valuable for people to know about that we want you in the program so that we can bring people here and show them what you're doing. And we were like, oh, okay, great. We will be more happy to be more rigorous on the application of the preps. The preps, I think, are to the last one, things that can't do you any harm and almost certainly do some good. And we believe in certification. We believe in that validation, that having to conform to a rigorous standard, that it shows something. So we did.
Let me ask you a question about that.
Yeah.
Just as a devil's advocate. So I too, like, I struggle with this idea of certification and it's important and it's, whatever. And the strongest argument that I've heard, and I wonder how you would respond to this, against certification is, why should I have to pay to show that I'm doing the right thing? Shouldn't, conventional farmers have to get certified for all of the chemical stuff that they spray into our wine? Or
I mean, I certainly am sympathetic to that argument, but it's not the way the world works.
Yes, sadly.
So I don't know. I tend to be pretty pragmatic in my approach to things, and I do find, at least, that a pretty high percentage of the people who talk about, well, we just don't get certified because of the expense, or because I don't believe in paperwork and all of that. Like, if you look in detail, they're also cutting corners and maybe wouldn't qualify for certification, or at the very least are hedging that they want to be able to do something that wouldn't be allowed under the certification program should the specific conditions that might mandate that occur.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well.
So I do think that, like, being held to a standard that you have a third party validating, I think it's meaningful. And I think
agree.
Encouraging people to be inside that system, particularly given that, like, really the paperwork is not that hard. It's not that expensive. Right. If you have the capability to do it and you're already farming that way, I'm a believer in that third party seal.
Yeah. Yeah. But it also sounds like you sort of backed into it. And I kind of love that idea of, you, like, realize just by following, ecological principles, you have, ticked off every box in a certification program. And then you're like, oh, well, let's just do that.
It does sometimes feel like that. And I know, so with biodynamics, we did have to do a little more of the prep stuff. We had to buy another quad in order to handle the volume of the preps and the application that we needed to do. But, like, we really were most of the way there. And we had a similar experience when we were approached in 2018 to be a part of the new Regenerative Organic Certification, where, I mean, they were looking for people to join the pilot program who were already basically farming in the way that they supported, because what they were looking for was feedback on how these overarching regenerative organic principles should be applied to different types of crops. So they didn't want a winery that was farming chemically to have to go through all the transition period. They wanted somebody who was basically doing the stuff that they cared about, who could give them feedback on the protocols. So when we joined that program, it's essentially 4 audits, though they've streamlined it a little bit now. But there's basically an organic certification, that was easy. We were already doing that. There's an animal welfare certification, and the animal welfare certifier who came basically spent half an hour riding around with Nathan and was like, "You guys are so far ahead of what the gold standard is for this that, like, I'm going to tell you now that I'm going to pass you. I just want to see the rest of the stuff you're doing."
Right.
There was the overarching like resource use reduction kind of piece of the ROC standard, where they said, well, you're basically doing the right stuff. You just need to be keeping better records. You need to be doing more soil testing. You need to be measuring the impact of the things that you're doing. And we're like, okay, that makes a lot of sense to us. And then there was the farm worker fairness piece, which was the place where we had to make the most changes, just because it wasn't involved in any of the certifications that we were doing. We were already paying our farm workers a living wage. We were already, their working conditions were already good, but there were a couple of things that they mandated that we do that we sort of realized afterwards, like, what, we should have been doing this for decades. And one of those was a weekly, I don't think they mandate that it's weekly, but they mandate that it be regular. But we decided to do a weekly roundtable discussion with our full-time vineyard crew, as well as our viticulturist, our vineyard manager, and then Neil, our director of winemaking, and basically talk through what we'd done the last week, talk about what we were planning to do the next couple of weeks, and really go around the table and get everyone to give feedback, which is a very non-hierarchical way of working, and was pretty foreign to our vineyard crew. Even though that they've been full-time employees, many of them full-time employees out here at Tablas Creek for 2 decades. And what we realized was that once you sort of established new levels of trust and sort of broke down some of the historical barriers and the generational barriers and the cultural barriers of wait, I'm supposed to give feedback here. We saw all of this interesting stuff. Like, for example, our equipment stopped breaking, and it wasn't, I don't think, that things were being treated any differently. It was that all of a sudden, instead of people thinking, I better not say anything, I might get blamed for something going wrong, there was enough trust that was built up that we would hear about stuff when it started to go wrong instead of after, like, it terminally wasn't working.
Right.
Which was super cool. Like, that was really interesting to see. And then the other impact was that we started seeing, like, the guys on our crew, again, who've been here for a long time in many cases, like, coming out on their weekends and bringing their families out to show them the things that they were working on. And like, just watching that develop was amazing. So we did have to implement some new stuff for the farm worker fairness piece of what we did. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of in terms of the actual farming, what we were doing on the ground, with the vines, like, we were sort of chosen to be a part of the pilot program because we already were doing most of the stuff they wanted.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, nothing to sneeze at being the first regenerative organic certified vineyard in the world.
No, it's something we're super proud of. I'm not trying to sneeze at it. I love that it essentially takes all of the soil health and biodiversity pieces of biodynamics and separates it from a lot of that mysticism stuff that I really agree with John Williams, that it's a distraction.
Right.
And probably prevents the uptake of this kind of farming, because people are like, yeah, right, I'll activate cosmic energies. Yeah, sure. Like, you'll catch me doing that when hell freezes over. Like,
right.
So having all of that updated without some of the kind of distracting philosophical, metaphysical language is helpful, but also having it updated to take into account all of the real advances in soil science and the understanding that people have of what's going on with the networks under the soil that like even 30 years ago they really didn't have. Right. So having a conscious focus on things like those microbial networks, the fungal activity under the soil, the benefits you get from reducing tillage to help allow those networks to grow, the fact that this allows your soil to break down the raw materials that may be applied or may just come naturally from the things that you're growing or the grazing that you're doing, and turn that into the building blocks for your crop, whatever it happens to be. Like the advances in understanding kind of that modern approach to what really great farming is really appeals to us, as does the fact that it ties in these things that were formerly outside of the certification programs, like a requirement to reduce your use of shared resources like groundwater and non-renewable energy. I mean, those weren't things that farmers were particularly concerned about in the late 19th century when biodynamics was being written about. Like resource scarcity wasn't a thing. So having that updated for the modern age, and then having it include the things like farm worker fairness and animal welfare, just makes it feel like it is a gold standard for great farming, not just for your land, but for your neighbors, for your community, for the people who work there, and for the broader environment in a way that no previous certification was.
Got it. Yeah. And I mean, you brought up a couple things that I would love to dig into a little bit more, but specifically the tillage aspect of soil health. I know you were helping to shape this program, and I think you gave them some feedback about, when and if tillage is always bad and things like that. And I'd love to know where you guys are with that now, because I know that's a very big, hot topic. And I think they went from no-till to reduced till in terms of their requirements or, their sort of encouragement, largely due to feedback from you in that certification. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think the idea, there are two ideas behind no-till that make a ton of sense, a ton of intuitive sense, that I think are fundamental. One is that you want to avoid bare ground whenever you can. And that's partly because it's a missed opportunity for photosynthesis. And really what you want your land to be doing is, from a broader climate perspective, is you want there to be plants on it, leaves on it, that are going to be turning that solar radiation and the atmospheric carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. I mean, it's a good thing for everyone. And then those carbohydrates, you're doing what you can to try to capture as much of that carbohydrate mass in the soil, so it does positive things rather than the atmosphere where it has negative impacts. So that's one thing which I think makes intuitive sense about reduced tillage. The other is what I mentioned briefly before, where you're trying to avoid disrupting those networks between roots and mycorrhizal fungi and microorganisms in the soil, where every time you sort of do a deep till and you turn deeper layers over and put them on top, and the shallower layers get put down deep, you end up destroying a lot of that life that's in the soil. So that becomes then counterproductive, and you start re-releasing you end up with decay of whatever the organic matter is, those roots, and that gets re-released into the atmosphere. So I think both of those are really important. The downside of having it be just an inflexible requirement that you can't till is that in a place like California, that leaves you with very little in the way of recourse against things like gophers and ground squirrels, whose networks can just end up exploding, and you can end up losing a lot of your vines to those underground rodents. Right. There's also transitional challenges where if you have a crop which has been essentially accustomed to not having competition with weeds and other things in an arid climate, the shock of introducing all of a sudden all of this competition can have some unintended consequences. So essentially where we are at the moment is we are with the sections where we have the ability to irrigate. So our trellised, closer spaced blocks, which are basically our oldest blocks. Those we have been no-till within the rows for the last 5+ years, and we just do a little bit of kind of in right under the vine, kind of cleanup with a shallow tractor attachment that's called a tournesol. It's really like a rotary tiller, slow-moving rotary tiller that just tills a couple of inches below the surface without turning stuff over. And those vines are old enough that we don't really worry so much about the gophers because the roots are down deep enough. They're down into the calcareous layers that the gophers don't really love. So they're relatively protected. The dry farmed blocks, we have older dry farm blocks that we've continued to do tilling on because, again, of the worries we have about shocking those blocks with introducing a lot of new competition and information from neighbors who've tried to do it and lost a lot of vines because of it. We have a few smaller, older, not quite as old, but older dry farm blocks that we have been doing our own transition to no-till to see how that goes. And then we have some new dry farm blocks that we've planted no-till so that we don't have to worry about a transition at all, that we've planted with the expectation that there's going to be kind of a permaculture of other stuff growing in around it, and the grapevines can grow from being newly planted with the experience of competition. And that's all still early enough. The oldest of those blocks is only 3 years old. So it's still early enough that I don't know that we have a lot in the way of conclusions, but we're trying to see how far we can push away from tilling without opening us up to risks that we consider like potentially devastating. So
Right.
That's sort of where we are. We're in this process where we're probably at this point, if you look in terms of acreage, probably 75% no-till, and the other 25% we're trying to do some experiments to see how we get there safely.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, and just being on the East Coast recently, I heard some farmers talking about who really don't like to till, but because of the amount of rain that they had and the fact that that meant they had to spray extra. So you have more tractor passes on wetter soil. They were thinking about running a keyline plow through between the rows just to create some aeration. So not do any like rototilling, but just stick a knife down into the soil to break up some of that compaction from this year. So I've heard mixed things about that as well. I mean, of course, you cut mycorrhizal connections and things like that in the soil, but it's that give take. Like if the soil is starved for oxygen, that might be a benefit anyway. Like the net, it might be a net benefit.
Yeah, no, I agree. We agree. I mean, we tend to do some keyline plowing before the rainy season anyway, which we do perpendicular to the slope of the hills on our steeper slopes so that it slows down the flow of water downhill and encourages it to soak in rather than running off.
Yeah.
And we feel like, again, the small amount that we're breaking up those networks is worth the other benefits. And I don't feel like the ROC protocols have any objection to things like that. It's not as though you can't ever break the ground. It's that the more that you are allowing those sorts of underground networks to flourish, the greater the benefits will be.
Right.
And I think that's pretty hard to argue with. But I also think that there are ways of intervening in a positive way that don't destroy those networks.
Well, I wanted to go back to a couple things, but gophers. So what else have you done to control for gophers?
Curse at them a lot.
You will say again?
Curse at them a lot.
I know the feeling.
So we have 43 owl boxes scattered around the property.
Uh-huh.
They certainly help. The challenge, one of the challenges with gophers is that they're nocturnal. So all of these lovely hawks and eagles that we have flying around don't do a whole lot of good against them.
Oh,
But
the
owls
gophers are
do.
nocturnal. I thought you were gonna. Okay, got it. I always thought
Uh,
gophers were. I always see them out during the day running. You drive up to a tasting room and you almost like run over one on your way down the driveway, kind of thing.
those, at least in my experiences, those are probably ground squirrels.
Oh, ground squirrels, very different. Okay, sorry. My ignorance.
Also horrible.
Right?
But no, active during the day. So that's one thing. We also do a lot of trapping. We have a couple of
Okay.
guys whose main job in the summer, when there's not a ton of other stuff going on, is just to set and empty gopher traps. And they'll catch like 60, 70 gophers a day in the peak of the summer, and you still barely keep up. I don't know. I'm open to other ideas. I would love to, we have feral cats that we feed to keep rodents at bay around the winery. I'm wondering if we can somehow attract feral weasels,
Ooh, yeah.
or more snakes, or
Yeah.
I don't know. That's gophers are a real problem, and
Of course,
I
the
don't
snake
feel like we've
options
come
in
up
your
with the
area
right
aren't
solution yet.
necessarily the most exciting for humans.
Right.
You probably rattlesnakes are probably your native steak species there, right? Well, you probably have some other good ones, right? King snakes.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly see rattlesnakes out here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, do I want to fill our vineyard with thousands of rattlesnakes? I'm not sure that that's really the great solution either.
Well, I'm thinking now of like farm to table gopher barbecue type thing. Like it sounds like a real potential
Rather you than me.
added value in the tasting room there. A little
Right next to the freezer case where we sell cuts of lamb. This will be very small cuts of gopher.
Gopher tacos. I'm all over. Well, another. I mean, you brought up sort of the problematic thing with organic. Similar to it's the same mentality as conventional, just swapping out sprays, some of which still aren't that great for the world. Generally speaking, they might be a little less insult to the earth, but
I think they're significantly less insult to the earth, but that doesn't mean that they're the best end solution.
Right. So are you experimenting with reduced sprays or no sprays at all in any sections?
No, not particularly. I don't know that that's really our goal.
Okay.
I mean, we're trying to spray thoughtfully. We're choosing to use. We use a lot of compost tea. We're using a lot of biodynamic preps, where those impacts are going to be positive. I mean, we have been able to reduce the amount of sulfur that we spray in the vineyard pretty significantly by using compost tea, and just by the fact that we're in a place that mildew is not usually a huge pressure. But I mean, I don't know that our goal is particularly to not spray. Our goal is to choose the right sort of thing to spray, and to choose things that are going to have, if at all possible, positive consequences on the life in the vineyard, not negative.
Right. Yep. And I'm going deep now, because I remember at one point this thing that sort of seemed strange to me. We were in the middle of, I think, the rain this winter. We just had this crazy rainy winter for California. And I remember you guys did a post about bring the flock into the barn, and it struck me as strange because I know people that are farming in contexts like North Dakota and upstate New York who specifically don't bring their flock in. And so I texted some question about, why do you guys bring the flock in? And the answer was something about, this is one of the, the 5 needs or the 5 requirements for, animal welfare, which is shelter for the animals. Is that, I mean, can you talk about that at all? I don't know if
Yeah,
like if this is
sure.
that important.
Sure.
I love the idea of using hardy stock that is meant to be outside year round, especially in especially in Paso Robles, where I know it gets cold, but it's certainly not like North Dakota and upstate New York. So I'm just curious, yeah.
No, for us, the biggest reasons are that if the soil is really saturated, and the sheep are out there, and we keep them in a fairly tight area in order to just like keep them grazing equally, they end up compacting the soil to an unacceptable degree. So we don't want them out there when the soil is really saturated, and certainly not before the cover crops have a chance to get well established, because they end up turning it into this like compacted mud pit, which does not then regrow. So typically what we'll do is we'll pull them out. I mean, we'll leave them out if it's a modest rainstorm. But if we've had like the peak of this winter, we had 20 inches of rain in 21 days. And like it was so wet out there that literally, I mean, you could see the impact of where we'd had the sheep for months afterwards, because they sort of trod things down into mud. So no, we're trying to get them out of there. Well, it's so wet that they're going to compact the soil, and then get them back into the vineyard as soon as we can after that.
Right. Got it. Well, okay. Now, those answer, this is great. These are my little fascinations. Now, you, I just want to establish that, I'm growing Tablas Creek clone of Syrah in my front yard vineyard. And, that it is a fabulous Syrah clone. And I mean, despite the fact that I've had some issues with it, with powdery mildew this year, I mean, it's no different than any other vinifera that way. But you guys essentially brought over every single grape from Chateauneuf du Pape, right? At great expense.
We have, in fact, at this point, like this brought over every single one.
I mean, like many of the clone, like, I mean, I don't know that most people realize, like if you're drinking, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, and the whole other list of things anywhere in America, it's quite possible that that is possible because of Tablas Creek.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things we realized early on, is that if we wanted to be able to replicate the diversity of the Bocage style vineyard, like we needed to bring a whole bunch of stuff in that had never been used in America before. And like that was a fairly easy choice. Like if we knew we wanted Grenache Blanc or Counoise or Picpoul or even Roussanne, like that wasn't here. So we had to bring it in. I think the larger question was, do we bring in new clones of the things that are already here? Like Mourvèdre, Grenache, Syrah, Viognier, Marsanne, those were here already.
Right.
And we ended up deciding that yes, we did, because there wasn't a lot of information that was out there about where those other clones had come from. We weren't confident that they had been chosen for quality rather than productivity. Because if you look historically at how Rhone varieties were used in California, I mean, particularly Grenache was used for like bulk jug wine in the Central Valley more than it was anything else. So like, could it get ripe and make sweet grapes at 20 tons an acre? Yes. Good. Okay, great. Plant it. So we decided to take advantage of the fact that we had French partners who had all of these varieties and multiple clones of many of the varieties in their own vineyard, and use that as our starting point. And one of the decisions we made early on, what did I say? I was in high school. I was not making this decision. But one of the decisions my dad and Jean-Pierre and François Perrin made early on was not to try to keep these vines proprietary, but instead to make them available to anybody who wanted to buy and plant them. Because we felt that the biggest thing that was holding back the category of Rhone varieties in California was that the clones themselves either weren't available or weren't great. And that if we could get these higher quality clones into circulation, that would help the whole category thrive. And so that was how we ended up in the nursery business of selling vine cuttings. And we've sold something like 5 million grapevine cuttings to 600 vineyards from Washington State to Texas, including 100 just here in Paso Robles. And so I think like it's really had the impact that we hoped it would. And that I think in some ways obscures the fact that it was a pretty big decision to make at the beginning to set aside what could have been a competitive advantage, and instead try to think of the health of the whole category. So I'm proud of what that nursery piece of the business has allowed to flourish.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those pieces that I don't, amongst all the other amazing things that you're doing, I think can sometimes get left by the wayside that, like, the significance of that to the American wine industry and anybody who likes these grapes and the wine made from them. It's a, bringing them over here can be a decade-long process for a single clone, right? Like it has to go
or longer. Yeah. I mean, we just got
yeah.
the most recent batch of imports that we started in 2003. Like we finally got the last of those grafted into the vineyard in 2019. So 16 years later, it had finally gone through 4 rounds of cleanup at UC Davis and been declared virus free and then released to us and propagated and finally had enough to plant in the vineyard. So yeah, it can be a very long process if things need to be cleaned up.
You must have a sort of long view perspective on this business.
I do. I inherited that. I think often of my dad, who started all of this in his mid-60s, knowing that he was doing it in a way that they wouldn't even have wine to show people for a decade, and that like he probably wouldn't even be around at the time when the vineyard sort of was getting to the age that the French would start to take seriously.
Right.
And I think that's about as good a definition of optimism as one that I can think of, is being willing to start a project that you think is worthwhile, knowing that you may never see its kind of apex. So yeah, I mean, I've been out here for 21 years at this point. I was lucky enough to get to work with my dad for the first 15 of them. But yeah, I mean, this was definitely conceived of as a kind of a generational and potentially kind of category defining project. And that was liberating, I think, in some ways at the beginning, in that like we knew we weren't trying to turn a profit on this in the first 15 years. I actually saw the initial business plan a couple of years ago, and like it showed us breaking even for a calendar year for the first time in year 13. Like that's if everything went right. And you know how optimistic like initial business plans before you've even like broken ground are. I mean, so if everything went right, we were going to have to put in money for the first dozen years before it became at least self-sustaining, like let alone paying you back the stuff that you already invested. So we were able to look at things with the perspective of like, what would we wish we had done if we had a generation's perspective on this, and use those sorts of decisions to help us answer questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said optimistic, but I almost feel like there's something more, it's almost more altruistic. Like it's thinking about somebody besides yourself, to be able to do that. And I wish there was more of that in wine and everything, frankly. But I mean, some of what you guys are doing that we haven't talked about, if we're, I'm ticking off these things in my mental list in my head, but the work that you've done in terms of containers and if it isn't news to anybody, I think anybody listening to this podcast, it's not news, but just the enormous percentage of wine's carbon footprint that is owed to glass bottles and shipping in glass bottles, and you guys have really tackled that in multiple fronts. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, so people probably don't realize it, but it depends a little bit on where the wine is going, but a pretty good general figure is that half of California wine's carbon footprint is attributable to the bottle.
Right.
So if we're serious about a lower carbon future, then we need to look there. That's where the biggest savings are going to be. So we've tried to address it in a bunch of different ways. We've tried to. I mean, one of the first things we did was move to lightweight glass more than a dozen years ago, which at the time was very much kind of opposite to the trend. A lot of California wineries were going heavier and heavier with their glass, and we just felt like it was inconsistent with all of the other things that we were doing. And we reached out to our customers and asked them what they looked for in a bottle, and we were expecting kind of a split between people saying, "Oh, I love the look and the feel of these larger bottles," and people saying, "Oh, please do what's right for the environment."
Right.
And instead, like 80% of the responses we got were, please just give me something that fits in my wine rack. And that gave us a lot of clarity in addressing this. We're like, oh, right, think about this in terms of utility.
Right.
And you realize that those big bottles, they're negative utility at almost every level. They're more expensive. They're heavier to ship. They're heavier to lift. They don't fit in racks. They take up more space, and they don't do anything in terms of helping a wine age any better. They have zero impact there. So anyway, so we moved to lightweight glass a dozen years ago, which again, I think if a winery wants to make a first step towards a lower carbon and also less expensive operation, the move to lightweight glass will save you 10% of your carbon footprint, just sort of right there in one fell swoop. Right. But beyond that, like, we're trying to think of the situations, the environments in which wine maybe doesn't need a glass bottle at all.
Yeah.
So for, again, about a dozen years, we've been selling or offering the Patelin de Tablas tier of what we do, which is basically the wines that we make for restaurants and wine bars to pour by the glass. We've been offering them in reusable stainless steel kegs through a partnership with Free Flow Wines up in Napa. So that's a zero waste package, both in terms of the packaging, because the stainless steel kegs get returned and washed and sterilized and reused, and also in terms of the wine, which is an important thing for restaurants to consider, because a lot of restaurants toss out a decent percentage of their by the glass wine, because if it's been open for a day or two and they're down to the bottom of the bottle, they're not going to keep it over another night. They're just going to dump it and start with fresh bottles. So that's I think been really encouraging. It's not a huge piece of what we do. It's like 10% of our production that we do in kegs. But again, if it doesn't need to be in a bottle, like why use all those resources to put it in a bottle? Right. And we transitioned our tasting room to pouring all of our tasting room samples out of keg at the beginning of this year. And that's another case where it's an idea I wish I'd had a decade earlier. But that's going to save us something like 10,000 bottles a year from ever needing to get made. It's going to save us wine and cost, wasted wine from open bottles, corked bottles, all of that. So that was something that I think is worth doing. And then last year this was spurred by a carbon footprint self audit that I did and published on our blog. One of the figures that I shared was from the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, which showed the different carbon footprints of the different weights of glass bottles, and it included as a fourth line on this chart the much lower carbon footprint of the 3-liter boxes. So essentially the bag-in-box, where there's a little, like a plastic or mylar bag inside of a cardboard box. And that is an 84% savings of carbon footprint over 4 glass bottles. And I just sort of dismissed that in the blog that I wrote, because the most expensive boxes of wine out in the market, if you go and look at them, are like $30 or maybe $35. And like our least expensive bottle is $28. So 4 of those bottles, like it just seems so out of line with what would be a possible price point for it that I just dismissed it. And I had a friend comment on my own personal Facebook page when I shared the blog saying, hey, don't you think that Tablas Creek could be the winery that would change people's perceptions on this? And I thought about it for quite a while and decided he was right. And so we did. We released our first wine in the boxes last spring, whatever, not 2023, but spring of 2022. Did the Patelin de Tablas Rosé, and at that point we made 324 boxes and just released it to our mailing list and to our wine club. And I was thinking we'd probably sell out in a month, and I was hoping, like, if this was a big success, it would be a week. And we sold out in 4 hours. And I got to spend the next week responding to frustrated people who were like, man, I wasn't at my computer and like it sold out already. And so we felt like that was a pretty significant proof of concept that people were willing to reconsider maybe their prejudices about the boxed wine package. And we continued that with the Patelin Blanc and the Patelin Red last year. We did it again this year. We scaled it up a little bit more. And then next year, our plan is to increase it again, kind of double the amount that we're doing, and release a little bit into a handful of markets for some wholesale. So for some independent retail and maybe a few restaurants who would love to use it to pour by the glass, but don't have the infrastructure for a keg system. So
Right.
I think that there's potential in there, and there's potential in things like the bottle reuse programs that a couple of places are starting to roll out. There's one called Revino in Oregon that is the first one that seems to be off the ground.
Yep.
There's a company in California called Conscious Container that's trying to do the same thing. I think there's a lot of potential in that, but there's also a lot of logistical hurdles to deal with. But yeah, packaging is the whatever 800-pound gorilla in the room of wine, really trying to get to a lighter carbon footprint.
Yeah, we have down here in Los Angeles trying to do a reuse program as well. OOM.
Cool.
Check them out. Yeah. I think I was one of those frustrated customers, but I did get a really nice email from you in response saying something like, "You snooze, you lose, sucker."
That sounds like me.
Just totally good. When or how did your sort of ecological consciousness individually sort of dawn? I mean, obviously you grew up as, sort of like a vineyard brat, and this is something that was, handed down to you, and I mean that in the nicest way, but but it's one thing when you're surrounded by this, but I can tell by the amount of energy and passion with which you speak about these things that it at some point became personal to you. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
I didn't have a sort of aha moment in any of this.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big believer in the power of incremental change. That a good business should be acting as though they're going to be around long enough that if they do everything 5% better each year, that the long run impact of that is enormous. So I think that goes back a little bit to the whole generational kind of lens that we think of as Tablas Creek. So it's not that I had this revelatory moment where I was like, "Ooh, we need to be better for the earth." It's that we kept trying to make the right small steps each year. And every now and then you realize that you have the opportunity to do something bigger. And I think the 2020 vintage was a pretty eye-opening moment for everybody out here in California in terms of the risks of climate change not being something which you're worrying about for like 30 years in the future, but that is something you need to worry about right now with the fires up and down the state of California and the heat spikes and the drought and all of the impacts that those had on the growing season. I have trouble imagining anybody making wine in California in 2020 and not coming away from that year thinking, okay, we've really got to figure this out. So I think that's some of it. I think some of it is, of course, I think some of it's the team that I work with. I know that these are things that that Neil really cares about. Jordy, who's our viticulturist, really cares about. That Nathan, when he was here, he obviously really cared about this, and certainly that level of energy and concern is infectious in the best possible way. And so I think we all feel like whichever piece of this business that we're a part of, that there are things that we can do to both be better custodians of the business and of the resources that we have the opportunity to apply, but also because of the platform that we've been able to build between our blog and our social media and the just the following that we have, that if we do something that feels like an innovation that's worthwhile, we can figure out ways to get other people watching and listening and moving along with us. And I've started to think a lot about the idea of trying to be the pebble that starts the avalanche. Because we can do what we can do on our 270 acres. And I think we're obligated to do the best thing that we can, but Like if we can inspire other companies, other wineries, other vineyards, other agriculture to make changes across thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres, like that's really where it gets exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, again, 270 is nothing to sneeze at. And I mean, I think it can be said that you are enacting these solutions at scale. And I mean, it might be, some people might sort of be skeptical of like a 10-acre solution or a 5-acre solution of any of the things that you are doing. But I think when you get over 100 acres, it's kind of easy then to jump to 1,000 acres, and people kind of have to start paying attention. Like you are absolutely in the pocket of where you have to be taken seriously, and yet you're leading on so many things that I think are, if they were embraced by the other thousands of acres, hundreds of thousands of acres, would be totally world changing. So I think
that's ultimately, I think, the value proposition of Regenerative Organic Certified is that, like, agriculture accounts for something like 31% of the Earth's landmass. And if it can be a part of the solution to these big picture challenges like resource scarcity and climate change and inequality and topsoil loss and all of that, like, these problems have a chance of getting solved.
Right.
If it can't be a part of the solution, these may not be solvable problems. So,
right.
I mean, I just saw the press release from the Regenerative Organic Alliance a few weeks ago that said that they now had 1 million acres worldwide under ROC certification. Like, that's amazing.
Right.
That's a really big number. And wine is just a small piece of that. But the fact that you have somebody of the scale of Fetzer Bonterra that has gotten the ROC certification for their 1,000 plus acres of their home ranch, like that, like, again, like, I do feel like we have some scale, but they're certainly much bigger scale than us. And to see that rolled out at even larger scale is super exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And having said all of this, I think my final question, which I mentioned to you in advance, is more of just a comment that, I know that you guys have beautiful winemaking, and we haven't talked about the winemaking at all. I'd love you to talk, about what you do in the winery, what goes into the winemaking. And my understanding is that, or the comments that I've heard in the natural wine community, I feel like you are left out of the natural wine community, despite all of this incredible stuff that you're doing, simply because of, I'm not sure, because of a few interventions in the winery that, are considered too intrusive in winemaking. And I'm just at a point in my life where I see the kind of farming that goes into so much of what is considered natural wine, and it's so subpar. And in most cases, and in many cases, it's the kind of farming you were talking about, where it's practicing but not certified, and part of vineyards are, set aside for this, winemaker, even though the rest of the vineyard's conventional, and maybe, whoops, they might have accidentally sprayed that year, but let's not talk about that. And yet they get within the natural wine family. And I'm just at a point where I don't want to be part of a group that can't include you, and so if natural wine wants to exclude you, then I don't want to be part of that group. But I wonder if you could just talk about, have you experienced any of that? And, like, can you talk about your winemaking a little bit?
Yeah. So I have some issues with the whole idea of natural wine. I mean, I guess maybe not the idea. The idea of natural wine is great. I mean, you have grapes that are farmed organically, biodynamically, naturally, fermented with native yeasts, which we also do. We've only ever used native yeasts, without a lot of the more obvious interventions in a winery. So without a lot of new oak, or without flavor additives or nutrients or whatever, all that kind of stuff. The place where the problems I have are two. One is that the idea that there is this hard line between what is natural and what is unnatural, which strikes me as tremendously counterproductive overall.
Yeah.
The other is that it seems like the hill that a lot of natural wine wants to die on is the use of sulfur in winemaking.
Right.
And as you know, and I'm sure most of your listeners know, sulfur has two main uses in fermentations. One is that it, in small quantities, allows fermentation yeasts to be active, but discourages the action of various sorts of spoilage yeasts like volatile acidity and Brettanomyces and those sorts of things. The other is that it is an antioxidant, and so it helps wine have shelf life.
Right.
So I certainly think that sulfur can and often is overused. We've always kept our sulfur additions below the international organic and the international biodynamic standard of 100 parts per million.
Right.
But I don't think, and I don't feel like we should need to apologize for wanting the wines to taste like the grapes and the place and the year, instead of like whatever random spoilage yeast happens to be wandering around the cellar.
Yeah.
And a lot of the natural wines that I taste, like they like I can actively identify the fermentation mistake. Like I can tell you what that is that's in there, whether it's Brett, which I don't always hate, or whether it's volatile acidity, or whether it's whatever. I mean, we could list them off. So, I think the idea of intervening less to show off the character of place and the grapes and the year is a really wonderful thing. But I think that in order for those things to actually show, the fermentations need to be clean.
Right.
Otherwise, instead of showing off whatever that natural thing is, you're showing off a science experiment. So I don't know. I mean, I have one thing I have found in defense of the natural wine community is that since we got the Regenerative Organic Certification, I feel like whenever I've had a chance to present at a wine bar or restaurant or whatever that sort of identifies with the natural wine movement, like once I get the chance to explain the regenerative organic piece to them, at that point they're like, okay, we're in. Like, this is good. This fits any possible definition we have of what natural wine should be. Whether or not that translates to the customer who is used to tasting something which is kind of cloudy and sour because it's like that's the particular like natural wine flavor profile that you sometimes get. Like, I don't know. I'm not there for that particular interaction, but I do feel like since we got that regenerative organic certification, like I haven't felt any resistance from gatekeepers at those kind of natural wine places that I do think I felt before.
Oh, that's good to hear. Really, yeah. So just being the first, you just had to be the first regenerative organic certified
no big deal
in the world.
Nothing much.
Yeah, no sweat, no big deal. Well, that's good. I mean, it is good to hear that, and I it's tough. I know I think there are two sides to the natural wine crowd where I think there are a lot of great people who are farming first and don't want to talk about sulfur, and their personal choices in the winery to be very hands off, take a back seat to the way that they're farming, and that's what they want to talk about is like what's going on in the vineyard. And then there's sort of a scene, a sort of cliquey scene of natural wine that has an in group and an out group, and I think there's a lot of natural washing that goes on in that realm, and so I don't, maybe it's just a matter of focusing on the right people and the right producers, and none of this is really an issue.
I don't know. I mean, I do think that transparency is a real thing of value and should be encouraged in in wine in general.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to the changes that are going to be forced by us having to start to do things like ingredient labeling and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, which I know there are wineries that are really dreading. I think overall it's probably going to have a positive impact in the long run. It's going to be distracting in the short run, but I think it's a good conversation for us to be having, and it's one I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I voluntarily have been listing ingredients on our labels since I started my winery, and I now just made the decision to give people an opportunity to go to the website to find a full list of ingredients, because I was having so many conversations with people who thought that because I listed ingredients, I was unlike every other wine that was just made with grapes, and my ingredients lists are like grapes and sulfites, and they're like, oh, so, it was more like this education because nobody else is doing it, that like I stand out as the one who actually has multiple ingredients. And I'm like, no, look, it's just, I'm trying to show you how little I put in relative to what,
No, you're missing my main point.
Exactly. So until, everybody's required to do it, it actually, handicaps those of us who are trying to be transparent and are proud of the fact that we add so little, to the wine besides grapes. And so it's interesting. So it will be, I'm very much looking forward to that as well. Should be a fun change in the industry and much needed. But also in the same vein, like in terms of transparency, I fully support and think we need a certification for natural wine if people are going to continue to use that and, make lists based on that. Like there absolutely should be just a third party certification. Because otherwise it's, I know what's happening and it's not transparent and it's not intended to be, not intended to be transparent. So
right. Well,
anyway,
the counterculture doesn't believe in certification anyway. So good luck.
Right. Do you have any closing things that you wanted to say, or even just, where can people find out more?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess that would be what I would say in closing, is that if people are interested in stuff like this, we really do try to be as transparent as we can and share our own journey and our own struggles and our own discoveries. So if people want to learn more about any of this or engage with us, you can find us on just about every channel, every social media channel. We're at Tablas Creek. Our website is tablascreek.com, and our blog is linked off of there, and have lots of really interesting conversations on the blog, whether it's about the farming side of stuff, the winemaking side of stuff, the business side of stuff, the regulation and labeling side of stuff. I mean, wine is a very multifaceted sort of business, at least an estate winery is, and that's one of the things that keeps me really energized and engaged in doing this, is that like I could be in a totally different aspect of it one day than I am the next. And I try to share all of that diversity and all of the different threads that make this up in the way that we communicate about what we do. And the blog is probably the most kind of the most transparent piece of all of that. So yeah, if people want to engage with any of that, I'd point them there and encourage them to come out and visit. It's a lovely spot, and we try to get people into the vineyard and into the cellar if that's what they want to do. And there's no better place to do that than right here where it all happens.
Yeah. If you're going to Paso Robles, it should be you guys should be the Mecca of Paso Robles. For anybody traveling there for wine tasting. Definitely worth it. I had a lovely time there, and it was like a tour and tasting. Of course, your wines are fabulous. We haven't even really talked about that. I just had a bottle of your Côte de Tablas. I think it was 2021. Shared with a bunch of neighbors just a couple days ago, and beautiful stuff. Always, reliably beautiful and very interesting as well. You do a lot of strange bottlings of individual things from Chateauneuf, some grapes that some people have never heard of that are really interesting and worth checking out. Yeah, so there's my little plug. Thank you for doing what you do and continuing to do it. I really am glad you guys are out there fighting that good fight.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to get to do it, and it's a fascinating business to be a part of, and I'm still grateful that, like, in this day and age, I get to make an actual physical product that people can then share and enjoy, and hopefully enhances their lives. And like that's a pretty rare thing, and it's something I don't take for granted.
Well said. Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Thank you so much for listening. I want to end with another thank you to Nick Dugmore for his sponsorship of this episode. Nick is Stoke Wines in Australia. That's stokewines.au for his website. Contacting him. Also, check out last week's episode with Nick. He's got an incredible story to share. There's so many ways that you can support this podcast. If you're interested in joy and want to promote this message, you can subscribe via Patreon. You can leave a positive review. That's super helpful. You can follow or subscribe to the feed, whatever that is, so that you're downloading episodes. That's a great thing that we can track. You could send me a note at connect@organicwinepodcast.com. You could tell somebody about it. Or, like Nick, you could become a sponsor. Contact me at connect@organicwinepodcast.com if you're interested in doing that. And thank you so much for your support. It is why this podcast can happen. Thank you.